If you live in the U.S., you've probably heard of March Madness. Now, it's a highlight of college basketball here in the States every year, and we're right in the thick of it. It's probably meaningless to most of you, but basketball presents a perfect lead-in to a talk on resurrection. Bear with me, and I think you'll see what I mean. Let me ask you, who is the greatest basketball player of all time? A couple of names probably come to mind, maybe Michael Jordan or LeBron James. Let's take just one of them for now. How do we celebrate LeBron? Well, with posters, jerseys, trading cards, documentaries, and perhaps the greatest symbol of flattery of all time, the bobblehead. These are all designed to show off his incredible accomplishments. Whenever you see an image of LeBron, it's not a picture of him injured, sitting on a bench. Never. No, it's a picture of him doing some amazing dunk or improbable layup. That's how we like to remember our sports heroes, don't we? Now, if I were to ask you, who is the greatest person of all time, who would you nominate? Many people would naturally say Jesus. Of all the people who have had the greatest impact on mankind, Jesus would be at the top of many people's lists. So, how do many people celebrate Jesus? With a crucifix, or at least a cross. Everywhere we look, it seems that Jesus is not celebrated always by his victory, but by his agony. Walk into many Christian churches around the world, and the most prominent symbol in the sanctuary will be a crucifix depicting Jesus not as the victor over death that he is, but as the victim suffering on a cross. But that's not how we celebrate our cultural heroes. Why the double standard? I know that many relate to the crucifix as a symbol of the suffering we all experience on our way to salvation. Life is not an easy road, but neither was LeBron's journey to stardom. There was a movie called The Passion of Christ, which depicted Jesus' challenges that he endured on his way to the crucifixion, but I have yet to see a movie called The Passion of LeBron. It begs the question, why do we focus on the agony of Jesus, but on the triumphs of our heroes? Do you see where I'm going with this? The resurrection always seems to be overshadowed by the crucifixion in many churches and religions. Jesus' victory over the flesh, it takes second seat to his struggles in the flesh. Why do you suppose that is? In my view, it's because the resurrection is, for many people, misunderstood. People can relate to the misery and suffering that we experience in our daily lives, but we have a hard time relating to the most significant event in human history, overcoming mortality, because none of us have experienced that. It's hard for us to get our heads around anything we can't perceive physically with our eyes or our limited senses. As a result, most people think of the resurrection of Jesus as a miracle, a one-and-done event, a divine intervention that happened once, is over, and will never happen again. If this were actually true, it would have little relevance to us except as an interesting story, wouldn't it? But there was something much more consequential taking place at that moment. It was so profound that Jesus was willing to offer the noblest sacrifice of all for it. Greater love hath no man than this, he said, that a man lay down his life for his friends. And that's exactly what he was doing. But why sacrifice his life for his friends and not just for himself? Because the resurrection was not just for Jesus. It was for all of us, you and me. All who are willing to learn from him and follow his teachings. These are Jesus' friends. Everything Jesus taught and did was intended for our instruction. He said, I am come a light that they might, I am come that they might have life and that they might have it more abundantly. He wasn't talking about a life of material abundance. He was talking about the life that is abundance, spiritual life. To experience this life requires a resurrection from the paltry material view of life into a higher sense of life, of spiritual life. How many times do we read in the Bible that Jesus was teaching in their synagogues? What was he teaching? Could it have been the way to resurrection? When Thomas asked the Master how we are to know the way, Jesus answered, I am the way. And he said that none of us could ever know the Father except it be by the way he taught us. He said, he that believeth on me, the works that I do shall he do also. If we are to do his works, doesn't that imply that there must be a resurrection awaiting each one of us? And maybe not just one. Paul said, I die daily. If that's true, wouldn't that imply that he must have been resurrected daily? Paul insisted that we must put off the old man with his deeds and put on the new man. Paul was not talking about revitalizing our fleshly bodies, but rather abandoning the belief in a fleshly body altogether and understanding what it means to be God's perfect sons and daughters. Some aspect of Paul's physical nature was dying daily, probably hourly, and was being replaced with a clearer concept of his spiritual sonship. This is a mental resurrection, not a physical one. The imperative for doing this, to use his own words, was because if in this life only, this body, we have hope in Christ, we are of most men most miserable. You see, the physical man is not the real man, but is a material concept of man, which cannot comprehend, let alone experience, the freedom and bliss of the real spiritual man that God made in his image and likeness. To understand this requires resurrection. Paul was a living example of this. Before his conversion to Paul, he had been known as Saul of Tarsus. Saul was a Pharisee, a zealous defender of Judaism. He was one of the most feared persecutors of the early Christians. We read that Saul began ravaging the church, entering house after house, and he would drag away men and women and put them in prison, and that he breathed threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord. What a lovely man. That was Saul before his ego concept of himself was crucified, and he humbly accepted his spiritual nature and oneness with Christ. This revelation converted him into one of the greatest apostles, teachers, and missionaries the Christian world has ever known. Was not this a resurrection? And what of David, who shamelessly ordered the death of a devoted soldier so he could have his wife? When he lost his cherished child by her and realized the depth of his sin, we read that he fasted and went in and lay all night upon the earth. His remorse was so deep and his repentance so honestly felt that he overcame his sin and went on to become one of the greatest kings of all time, who would later write some of the most inspiring literature Christianity has ever known. Was not this a resurrection? These stories, and many more like them, give us a more expansive view of resurrection. It's not just a matter of rising from an earthen grave. It is the daily practice of rising from the mental graves that have buried us in the dream of mortal imperfection, sickness, sin, disease, and death, and accepting our present status as God's perfect, sinless, healthy image and likeness, as revealed in the first chapter of Genesis. Putting off the old man is a moment-by-moment exercise. It happens every time we discard some aspect of who we think we are as mere mortals and see ourselves as God sees us. This is resurrection thinking, releasing the world's concept of who we are and adopting the true concept of who we have always been. We would all want the old man to die daily if we knew the freedom that awaits us when we put on the new man that God knows. Mary Baker Eddy, the discoverer and founder of Christian Science and author of its textbook, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, describes this experience as a great, great blessing. She says, "There is with us at this hour this great, great blessing. We begin with, 'Prove me now herewith, if I will not open you the windows of heaven and pour you out a blessing.' And we go to the Gospels, where we hear, 'In the world ye shall have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world.'" So let's dive into this great, great blessing, this process of overcoming the world and its tribulations, what might be called resurrection thinking. If the biblical accounts of Jesus were nothing more than a collection of inspirational or improbable events, one could probably be excused for thinking that the resurrection was an unrelatable moment in history. It would be about as practical to us today as a buggy whip or a payphone. Mrs. Eddy wrote, "Mere historic incidents and personal events are frivolous and of no moment unless they illustrate the ethics of truth." The experiences of Jesus have more than just historical value. They chronicle his path to resurrection. Every new account built on the ones before and answered in some degree the question from Thomas, how can we know the way? Jesus' resurrection was not a one-time event, but the culmination of a lifetime of resurrections that were lifting his thought above the Son of Mary and ever closer to the Son of God. He was modeling for us the way of salvation, what Christian Science defines as life, truth, and love understood and demonstrated as supreme over all, sin, sickness, and death destroyed. Jesus didn't simply leap out of the manger and raise people from the dead. He had a learning curve just like we do. The first 30 years of his life were probably not that different from yours and mine. We don't know much about these years, other than that he spent most of his time in Nazareth as a carpenter. His first recorded demonstration at the age of 30 was rather simple by his later standards. He turned the water into wine at a wedding celebration. As amazing as that was, it would be dwarfed 3 years later by an even more impressive demonstration, including his resurrection over mortality altogether, and ultimately his ascension. This is important to think about because, as the writer of Hebrews says, we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way just as we are, yet he did not sin. Jesus was born of the flesh to show us how to do what he did. Had he been any less material than we are, people might be justified for claiming that the resurrection could only happen once. But that's not how the narrative reads. Jesus was born of a human mother in very humble surroundings and had to grow into the full understanding of his divine sonship just as we do. In every way, he was our exemplar, or the way. What was this way? It was the way of resurrection thinking. Dying daily, putting off the old man, and putting on the new. Like every journey, it is taken one step at a time. Mrs. Eddy described it as the new birth. And what a lovely way of looking at it. Instead of dying daily, we are reborn daily. She said, the new birth is not the work of a moment. It begins with moments and goes on with years. Moments of surrender to God, of childlike trust and joyful adoption of good. Moments of self-abnegation, self-consecration, heaven-born hope, and spiritual love. It's notable that Mrs. Eddy referred to Jesus' resurrection from the tomb as his final triumph over body and matter, implying that there must have been other triumphs along the way. She also referred to his resurrection as the final proof of all he had taught, as if to say, there must have been other proofs that led to his final resurrection. Jesus was teaching us how to take every experience we face and turn it into a resurrection opportunity, the culmination of which leads us to our final resurrection out of this mortal experience. Maybe an analogy would be helpful. Imagine yourself as a lumberjack. You walk up to a large tree you need to fell, and being a beefy lumberjack, you whip out your axe and you start taking some swings. 100 strokes later, and you're still taking swings, and the tree hasn't fallen. But then, all at once, you give it a big heave-ho and whack it with all your might, and it falls. This was a big accomplishment, but let me ask you a question. Which swing felled the tree? The last one? You and I all know that it wasn't a single blow that brought it down. And that's the point. There is a lot of learning to do before we reach salvation. A lot. It's a journey, but a journey well worth taking. Mrs. Eddy said, to understand God is the work of eternity and demands absolute consecration of thought, energy, and desire. But rather than it being a depressing process, it's a joyful one. Joyful because every resurrection along the way brings new and better views of divinity that free us from the suggestion that we're sinning mortals with many mortal faults. A line of reasoning that has brought you and all mankind nothing but fear, sorrow, sickness, and suffering. Let me share with you a story of resurrection. A resurrection of thought, mind, and body. See if you can tell what the resurrection was. It's a story about a blind man. He had been relegated to the life of a beggar. He was making his way down a bustling road. There wasn't much to suggest that anything had changed on this particular day. He was buffeted on every side by people who had known him for years as the blind beggar, worthy only of being an outcast. The self-righteous glances and hushed aspersions that had been his daily diet were no doubt in full force that day. For as long as he could remember, they'd been hurled at him, and for the most part, he believed them. But this day was different. For the first time ever, he walked with confidence. The self-pity and self-consciousness that were his constant companions were not to be found. The impatient looks and painful comments were still thrown at him like stinging darts, but whereas in the past they might have dashed his spirits, today they didn't stick to him. He knew something no one else knew. He felt safe and protected. His secret, clutched so close to his heart that nothing could make him loosen his grip, kept his mind trained on his destination. The command from the stranger, "Go, wash in the pool of Siloam," rang in his ears. That was his all-consuming objective now, to make it to the pool and wash. Let the people think what they wanted. He knew that every step he took was a step out of the tomb of mental darkness in which he had been living, and a step closer to freedom. The stranger, Jesus, as he would later learn, had cast off a burden that the world had imposed on him like a death wish since birth. Neither hath this man sinned, nor his parents, Jesus had said, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him. With those words, the blind man heard, perhaps for the first time, that he was not born a sinner, nor was he destined to be one. He was the blessed child of God, the royal image and likeness of the perfect, almighty Creator. What a sense of liberation that must have given him, like rising from a prison cell and taking his first breath as a free man, as a new man. For too many years he had listened to the passers-by and had taken their comments to heart. Now, all the memories of hopeless, helpless, and filthy were coming to the surface to be discarded once and for all. But why Siloam? Jesus could have just as easily healed him right where he met him on the roadside. Could it not have been a symbol for washing away the beliefs of the old man he had held on to so tightly for so long? He had to let them go, and he was doing just that. His eyes, those symbols of mental blindness that had kept him from seeing himself as God's image, had been anointed by Jesus. In other words, his consciousness had been awakened by the Christ to glimpse his holy state as the Father's pure and sinless child. He had put on the new man. The blind man now knew something those around him didn't. He had always been the blessed child of God, holy and perfect. That picture of a blind beggar was never his story. It was nothing more than a world belief he had attached to himself until his vision was lifted to spiritual heights and he let the Christ wash over him. He had to make that trek to Siloam. He had to confront and repel every belief he had accepted through the years and wash them all away. What a sight that must have been. Those who had known him only as the blind baker saw something they never expected, the incurable cured. Now it was they who needed to be washed of spiritual blindness. Since the world began, they exclaimed, was it not heard that any man opened the eyes of one that was born blind? Now it was a healed man, the former object of their scorn, who was giving them a glimpse of what he had learned, a resurrection from the self-destructive consequences of thinking that he was born a sinner and would die a beggar. There were plenty of resurrections in this story, weren't there? He was resurrected from the belief that he was born a sinner. He was resurrected from the belief that he was a victim of other people's thoughts. He learned he had always been God's loved child. And he saw the Christ that his earthly vision had never perceived before. These were all resurrections. But he had to do something before he could experience them. Putting off old habits and beliefs and adopting the new man in God's image is demanding. It doesn't just fall on us like an apple from a tree. This man had to confront every false image he was presented with and deny them. He had to wash himself, unwind himself from every limiting belief he had accepted since childhood. He had to think and act like the new man he always was before his vision was recovered. And he wanted it so badly that that nothing would stand in his way of achieving it. And that's what it takes. Here was a perfect example of what Mrs. Eddy defines as resurrection. Spiritualization of thought. A new and higher idea of immortality or spiritual existence. Material belief yielding to spiritual understanding. Now, if this were just a one-time event, it might be of passing interest to us. But aren't we all the blind man at times? Don't we all have to wash ourselves of the claims the world is trying to attach to us? You're too old, too young, too weak, too sick, too vulnerable, too poor, too uneducated, too homely, too average to ever be successful. It makes no difference what those claims are or how long we've held on to them. Let the world call out incurable. Those claims can't stick to us when we know that we are not that old man the world claims we are. We are the new man, the men and women of God's creating, God's ideal and perfect image, his very likeness, never touched by any claims of sickness, sin, disease, or death, because God never is. Do you not hear from all mankind of the imperfect model? Mary Baker Eddy asks. The world is holding it before your gaze continually. The result is that you are liable to follow those lower patterns, limit your life work, and adopt into your experience the angular outline and deformity of matter models. She goes on to say, to remedy this, we must first turn our gaze in the right direction and then walk that way. We must form perfect models in thought and look at them continually, or we shall never carve them out in grand and noble lives. Isn't this what the blind man was doing? Your present perfection is only unknown to mortal consciousness, which cannot comprehend spirit. It is no secret to God. It is all that God knows about you right now. As his image, it's all that you can really know, too. It is the underlying fact of creation. Understanding this breaks the enslaving fetters of mortal thinking that chain us to a life of limitation and gives us confidence to resurrect ourselves, lift ourselves out of destructive thinking into the understanding of glorified living as God's children. This is resurrection thinking. Everything Jesus experienced was leading to his final triumph over body and matter, and it was teaching us how to do the same. We've discussed how resurrection is the process of putting off the old man and putting on the new, but someone might argue that that sounds subjective. Who's to say or even know what the old or new man is. Not God. That might come as a surprise to you. God is the standard. He doesn't judge between good and bad any more than the law of mathematics judges between your calculations and miscalculations. Mistakes are completely unknown to the law of numbers, which operates flawlessly. Any departure on your part from the rules brings its own consequences, but the law of numbers doesn't dole out punishment. It's no different with the law of God. God is goodness itself, the omnipresent, omnipotent law of love. And because infinite God fills all space is filled with good, with love. The prophet even said of God, "You are of purer eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong." So God doesn't know the old man or a mortal man. If that's the case, then what is the old man we're trying to put off? Paul described it as a mental state, the carnal mind, and Mrs. Eddy labeled it mortal mind. Either way, it's a product of the mind, a mental illusion, similar to a dream. It has no reality except what the dreamer gives it in his dream state. There is no question that it seems real. All dreams do when we're in them. But they never rise above the imaginary to the real. When you awake from them, everything that seemed so real simply vanishes with no lingering effects. Paul refers to overcoming this carnal mind or old man as casting down imaginations. So the substance of this experience we call the human condition, which seems so real, is nothing more than an extension of our thinking. It is imagination or a dream state. How does this carnal mind work? You're actually more familiar with it than you realize. Remember the lumberjack analogy? It took 100 strokes of the axe to fell the tree. I can only imagine that somewhere on or around stroke number 50, the thought popped into your head, this is all a waste of time. This tree hasn't fallen yet. In fact, it probably never will. I'm going to quit now. That's the carnal mind. Right there, when you're making progress with those critical and progressive strokes, the carnal mind suggests it's all a waste of time. But you have a choice, don't you? You can listen to that carnal mind suggestion, drop the axe and walk away, or you can ignore it and continue the work, knowing as you should that not a single swing is wasted in your progress towards accomplishing this task. As long as you're swinging, you're winning. It's important to remember that that carnal mind thought doesn't have the power to make you stop. It's just planting the suggestion. The temptation to stop may grow even greater by stroke number 80 or 90, but it's still no more than a suggestion. You keep sweating and swinging until you reach 100 and the tree falls. Then you realize that all along you had been making progress. The suggestion that you couldn't do it was a lie. It wasn't even your thinking. You wanted to finish what you started, and you did. That's the carnal mind and how it works. Similarly, many people believe that God is love and God is all. But the carnal mind keeps suggesting that that's nonsense, that evil is real, and we live on a dead-end treadmill of toil, sickness, sin, and death. What we forget is that we, like the lumberjack, have a choice. We can listen to that voice and surrender ourselves to that dead-end life, or we can recognize that claim as the suggestion it is and strive even harder to see what God, divine love, sees, knowing that every swing of that mental axe, every effort to understand our spiritual selfhood is never wasted, but is one step closer to revealing what is true. This is resurrection thinking. Whenever we deny the mortal picture, we are one step closer to the promise of lifting ourselves out of carnal mind thinking and into the promise of eternal life and harmony. In Mrs. Eddy's words, it is lifting thought above error or disease and contending persistently for truth. This is the way that Jesus was teaching us to follow. Jesus walked on the waves, fed the multitude, healed the sick, and raised the dead in direct opposition to material laws, we're told in Science and Health. Mrs. Eddy goes on, his acts were the demonstration of science, overcoming the false claims of material sense or law. It's important to remember that Jesus never claimed to be God. He said, "My doctrine is not mine, but his that sent me." He was revealing the Christ, what Christian science defines as the divine message from God to men, speaking to the human consciousness. Paul referred to Jesus as the mediator. He said there is one God and one mediator between God and men, the man Christ Jesus. This is very important to understand, because while Jesus isn't here today to teach us the way, the Christ is still teaching us the way. How, you might ask? In what well might be called a do-it-yourself textbook on resurrection. It's called the Sermon on the Mount, and it reads like a resurrection roadmap. Let's take a look. Do you all need to stand and take a stand for 30 seconds or so? Take a breath, stretch. You all doing all right? Stand up for just 30 seconds. Okay, that's enough. That's enough. We have important things to cover now. No dancing. If ever there was a how-to manual on how to put on the new man, it would be Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. If you were to take all the wisdom of the prophets and patriarchs through the centuries, mix it all together, distill all the thou shalts and the thou shalt nots, and sprinkle in a little compassion, you would end up with its moral essence. That's what the Sermon on the Mount is. Following the instructions given in the sermon is literally to put on the Christ. It is the moral compass by which Jesus himself lived. John said it perfectly. He said, the law, the commandments, were given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. These are the rules for living. In clear and lucid terms, Jesus lays out for us in the sermon the requirements of a resurrection-trending life. It's not a smorgasbord or some sort of moral buffet. It wasn't intended to be a serving line where you can pass on the liver and onions and pile on the dessert. Think of it more like a blueprint for a construction project. First, you build the foundation, a strong, impregnable foundation. Then, piece by piece, you build the structure on top of it, each piece deriving strength from the ones before it, and each piece giving strength to the ones after it. With all the pieces in their proper place and tested, you have a masterpiece that cannot fall. The Sermon on the Mount is such a masterpiece. Jesus warned of the dangers that come from a smorgasbord approach to building this foundation. He said, anyone who listens to my teaching and follows it is wise, like a person who builds his house on solid rock. Though the rain comes in torrents and the floodwaters rise and the winds beat against that house, it won't collapse, because it's built on bedrock. But anyone who hears my words and doesn't obey them is like a foolish man who builds his house on sand. When the rains and floods come and the winds beat against that house, it will collapse with a mighty crash. It's interesting. I had already written this whole talk when I came across this statement in Science and Health. Quote, "The Sermon on the Mount is the essence of this science, and the eternal life, not the death of Jesus, is its outcome." It couldn't be more clear that this sermon is the key to resurrection. We could talk for a week on this sermon, so let's just try to summarize it here. Jesus starts with the Beatitudes, a list of the definitive character traits that define a Christian. There are 8 in all, but many commentators consider the 8th one to be not a character trait, but rather a condition that those who live the 7 traits will experience. So 7 character traits in all, which in biblical parlance is a symbol of completeness. Let's look at them. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Scholars often render such words as the humble, the meek, the lowly, and the poor as having more to do with the inward man than outward circumstances. Understood in this way, poor in spirit is not referring to financial poverty. Instead, it implies an inward poverty, or, to quote a commentator, those who in their deepest consciousness realize their entire need for God. Without an acknowledgement of our need for spirituality, or the new man, we cannot hope to gain the benefits that attend the new man. On the other hand, those who do recognize this need shall be comforted with the treasures of the kingdom of heaven when they seek them. So, recognition of our need for spirituality is the first building block in resurrection thinking. Blessed are they that mourn. This describes the feeling that results from recognizing our spiritual poverty, the emptiness of a spiritually barren life. At some point, we all recognize the futility of chasing material solutions for our happiness. It may not be a happy realization. Often it's pain or sorrow that brings it to light. But this state must be reached. There must be a surrender of all we have depended on as vital for happiness, accompanied by a desire to embrace the eternal, which is spiritual, knowing that the days of our mourning shall soon be ended and God will wipe away all tears from our eyes. Then, in the fullest sense, we shall be comforted. But suffice it to say that most people don't seek spiritual solutions as long as their material situation is comfortable. It is the experiences that try us most deeply that make us most mentally fit for receiving the Christ. Blessed are the meek. It doesn't matter who or how great you are in a dream. When you awake from the dream, you're back to where you were before you started. Paul described the whole human condition as imagination. Therefore, human greatness isn't all it's made out to be. It's a dream, illusion. Human greatness wilts in the presence of spiritual goodness. This was proven over and over throughout the Old and New Testaments. For example, when the meek Gideon's band of 300 men defeated an army exceeding 120,000, or when one man, Elisha, disarmed the entire invading army of Syria. Mrs. Eddy spoke of meekness and power as power when she wrote, "Great only as good, because fashioned divinely were those unpretentious yet colossal characters, Paul and Jesus." Titus describes the meek this way: they should be obedient, always ready to do what is good. They must not slander anyone and must avoid quarreling. Instead, they should be gentle and show true humility to everyone. These are those who stand to inherit the earth. Blessed are those who do hunger and thirst after righteousness. Does this really need an explanation? The psalmist said, "My soul breaketh for the longing that it hath unto thy judgments at all times." Mrs. Eddy says, what we most need is the prayer of fervent desire for growth in grace, expressed in patience, meekness, love, and good deeds. The prayer of fervent desire for growth in grace describes a heart that yearns for godly honors, not human, and this heart's desires will be filled. Blessed are the merciful. How do we express mercy? Well, in forgiveness, benevolence, charity, compassion, patience, kindness, tenderness, love. The merciful live the golden rule, love your neighbor as yourself. Further, they live what some call the diamond rule. Think about others as you would have them think about you. We're told that mercifulness is a two-way proposition with God. The psalmist said, speaking of God, with the merciful thou wilt show thyself merciful. Therefore, those who are merciful will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart. The Master differentiates between outward and inward purity. The purity of which he speaks is purity of consciousness in the spirit of Hebrews, having our hearts sprinkled from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. A clean body is of no importance without a clean conscience first. This is illustrated vividly in another admonition in Jesus' sermon. Whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery already with her in his heart. Impurity of thought or heart is as much a sin as is impurity of action. With a pure heart, we can recognize purity or see God. And blessed are the peacemakers. It is only fitting that the sons and daughters of a loving God would be loving themselves. Thus the writer of Colossians could say, "Let the peace that comes from Christ rule in your hearts, for as members of one body ye are called to live in peace." Peace is not a passive state, but an intensely active one. It is the uninterrupted expression of the qualities of God through each one of us, which makes us worthy to be called the children of God. And now the 8th beatitude. Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The character traits listed in the first 7 beatitudes form the moral fabric of a resurrected life. They are the complete package, if you will, of what a Christian is. The 8th beatitude departs from this convention. It describes the world's reaction to those who embody the 7 traits. Why would the world's response be one of persecution instead of eager embrace? Because the world here refers to that state of mind that denies God's allness and claims to have an existence of its own. To the spiritually minded, such a claim is toothless, but the material-minded find spiritual claims to be abrasive. A Bible commentary, Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown, explains how the world reacts to the 7 spiritual traits, and I'll share it with you here. It says, poverty of spirit runs counter to the pride of men's heart. A pensive disposition in the view of one's universal deficiencies before God is ill-relished by the callous, indifferent, laughing, and self-satisfied world. A meek and quiet spirit taking wrong is regarded as pusillanimous or cowardly, and rasps against the proud, resentful spirit of the world. Craving after spiritual blessings rebukes but too unpleasantly the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, and the pride of life. So does a merciful spirit rebuke the hard-heartedness of the world. Purity of heart contrasts painfully with painted hypocrisy, and the peacemaker cannot easily be endured by the contentious, quarrelsome world. It goes on, thus does righteousness come to be persecuted. But blessed are they who, in spite of this, dare to be righteous. The traits outlined in the Beatitudes are literally the way that Jesus described. If embodied and lived daily, they would be enough to resurrect us. The commandments lay down the law and open our eyes to sin and the need of redemption. Therefore, all the thou shalt nots. The Beatitudes, on the other hand, are the waymarks for living. Paul said, "For ye are not under the law, but under grace." Now, the rest of the sermon is filled with practical examples of how these 7 traits look when practiced in our daily lives. This is Jesus' roadmap for resurrection thinking, so it deserves to be studied. Jesus says that, as the light and salt and light of the world, we should never compromise the principles of godliness in an attempt to conform to this world. Rather, we should so live as to give all who know us reason to conform to the principles we espouse. These principles are not of human origin. They are the laws of God, expounded in the commandments and expanded in the Bible, in the Beatitudes. Whosoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. Anger and resentment have no entrance into the kingdom of heaven, but love and reconciliation do. Let these govern our interactions with others. Remember, blessed are the peacemakers. Never harbor hatred or resentment. Always address it and heal it. If your right hand makes you stumble and leads you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. That is, remove yourself from the source of temptation. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. That's from the Amplified Bible. Purity of thought is as important as purity of action, because the two are inseparable and thought always precedes action. The commandments established the law for behavior, but the Beatitudes set the standard for thinking. Whosoever shall put away his wife. Marriage is sacred, a covenant not to be broken. We should do all we can to preserve the sanctity of marriage. This includes sexual activity outside of marriage. Mrs. Eddy says, the nuptial vow should never be annulled, so long as its moral obligations are kept intact. But the frequency of divorce shows that the sacredness of this relationship is losing its influence, and that fatal mistakes are undermining its foundations. Divorce may be the best course of action when the moral obligations of marriage are broken. Mrs. Eddy divorced once under these circumstances, but she also said, hoping and working, one should stick to the wreck until an irresistible propulsion precipitates his doom, or sunshine gladdens the troubled sea. And if one is better than the other, as must always be the case, the other preeminently needs good company. Restoring the sacredness of this institution would strengthen families, lessen violence, and bring the entire world a step closer to its own resurrection. Swear not at all, neither by heaven, for it is God's footstool. Keep your vows simple, yes or no. Never make a promise or swear by the name of God, because while God never fails, you may, and that would discredit God. Love your enemies. Bless them that curse you. Do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. For he maketh his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sendeth the rain on the just and the unjust. Love even when it's hard. It's easy to love those who love us, but Jesus challenges the world's way of an eye for an eye and teaches us to love our enemies, emphasizing our role as peacemakers. For if ye love them which love you, what reward have ye? Take heed that ye do not your alms before men to be seen of them. Otherwise ye have no reward of your Father which is in heaven. Give quietly, humbly, from the heart, never for effect or recognition. Do not sound a trumpet before thee as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets. Instead, be like the poor widow who put her penny in the collection. Jesus said, this poor widow hath cast in more in than all they which have cast into the treasury. And of course, we find the Lord's Prayer in the sermon. During his entire ministry, the biblical record records only one prayer that Jesus gave us, his disciples. That fact alone should indicate how important this prayer is for Christian practice. And what is its focus? Humility. Thy kingdom come, and thy will be done, as well as forgiveness, grace, and deliverance from sin, disease, and death. If practiced, the Lord's Prayer meets every human need. When ye fast, be not as the hypocrites of a sad countenance. Not ritually, but literally, put aside motives and thoughts that adulterate your pure, humble petitions for God's blessings. Sincerity and humility, rather than public recognition, should be the motives behind your worship. Following God's directives is always joyful, not burdensome. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, Jesus said, and ye shall find rest unto your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt. Seek heavenly treasures that last, not earthly ones that spoil. What we seek betrays what we think. We cannot serve both God and mammon. Take no thought for your life, what ye shall eat or what ye shall drink, nor yet for your body, what ye shall put on. Trust God with all your needs. Have no doubt that just as he maintains every detail of the beautiful lily, so he takes care of you beyond your highest expectations. Judge not, that ye be not judged, and beware of self-righteousness. Jesus warns against hypocritical judgment and encourages self-examination before pointing out others' faults. Judge not according to the appearance, but judge righteous judgment, John says. Ask, and it shall be given you. Seek, and ye shall find. Knock, and it shall be opened unto you. Persist in prayer. Never give up hope. Those who ask, seek, and knock with earnestness will receive, find, and see that the doors of heaven are opened and have always been opened. Straight is the gate, and narrow is the way which leadeth unto life, and few there be that find it. Choose the path of righteousness, no matter how difficult it seems, and don't be persuaded by the tempting offerings of the wide, popular path. That path, while popular, inevitably leads to pain, sorrow, and suffering. And lastly, beware of false prophets, which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. Be discerning. The carnal mind takes many forms. Most of its suggestions are so subtle, it's hard to distinguish from your own thought. Its suggestions will lead you away from the moral standards outlined in the sermon and down a path that ultimately ends in depravity and pain. Don't be deceived by these false prophets. Beloved, believe not every spirit, John said, but try the spirits, whether they are of God, because many false prophets are gone out into the world. There is your roadmap for resurrection thinking. These are Jesus' teachings in a textbook. We would do well to learn from them. Following all the rules of the Sermon on the Mount may seem like a big ask. I'm not going to lie, it is. These commands run against the current of mortal existence, whose gate is wide and whose way is broad. In other words, whose way is easy. To follow the sermon is not to run with the crowd, and it's not just narrow. It's not just straight. Sometimes it seems like it's straight up. And it's not just narrow. It can sometimes seem precipitous. But the Bible assures us the way of the Lord is a refuge for the blameless. Jesus went on to demonstrate everything he taught, healing every kind of ailment and incurable condition, even death, walking on the water and stilling the storm, and ultimately overcoming death himself. That leaves only one question. If he was the way, then we should be able to do what he did, right? Were his teachings complete enough for us to do so? Is it possible or even conceivable that we will ever be able to witness a resurrection ourselves or see someone overcome death? Let me share a personal story with you, and maybe it will help you answer this question. It's not a story about rising from the dead, but an example of rising above death. What I described earlier as demonstrating our permanent status as God's perfect, sinless, healthy image and likeness when the world is screaming just the opposite. Several years ago, I joined some friends on a week-long bike ride in Alaska. Since we were headed for the wilderness, our bikes were loaded with a lot of gear. On the first day of the ride, while riding downhill on the shoulder of a busy 4-lane highway, I hit a patch of gravel. My bike momentarily slid out of control before landing me squarely in the rumble strip on the side of the road. Now, a rumble strip is that little strip of pavement that has depressions cut into it so that it vibrates a car's wheels and makes a loud noise when a vehicle drifts outside of its lane. It's super helpful for drivers, but it's super awful for bikers. At the speed I was moving, my bike began vibrating so violently that I could barely see where I was going. As if that wasn't bad enough, the handlebars on my bike broke completely free from the front wheel. I literally had no control over my bike at all. Before I knew it, my bike and I were merging gradually into heavy traffic that was moving much faster than I, probably 50 or 60 miles an hour. This was a disaster waiting to happen. Surprised motorists had to do some serious dodging to avoid me. I remember a large RV brushing so close to me that I thought I was going to scrape my shoulder on its side. There were cars everywhere. I didn't have time to formulate a prayer at that moment. It was all I could do just to stay upright. But as I often do, I had prayed for our safety that morning in preparation for the ride. And instinctively, my thought turned to God with a simple, "Father, save me and make it fast." At times like that, everything seems to happen in slow motion. In what seemed like an eternity, I crossed both lanes of traffic without making contact with a single vehicle and finally rolled to a stop in the grassy median. Physically shaking and grateful to be at a standstill, I observed the traffic around me. It was moving normally, smoothly, without even a sign of there ever having been an interruption. It was an eerily peaceful feeling. My friends, who were ahead of me and had watched this whole ordeal unfold, came to my rescue as soon as they could and had me look at my path. They pointed out specifically the lengthy skid marks from a large truck and trailer that had been bearing down on me as I drifted right in front of it. There was apparently no way it could avoid me. With traffic on its left side and the shoulder of the road on its right, my friends were convinced that it was lights out for me. But surprisingly, I never heard the screeching of tires, never smelled the burning of rubber, never heard the horn they said that was blaring at me as it came up behind me. In fact, I never even saw the truck. My thought was consumed with only one thing at that moment: how God was going to pull me out of this ordeal. Being grounded in the conviction that he would never put me, his loved child, in harm's way, the physical circumstances around me conformed to what I was affirming mentally, and no harm came to me at all. Just like when Jesus didn't experience the storm that was so terrifying to his disciples in the boat. As I said, by the time I came to a stop in the median, the traffic was moving so smoothly that no one would have ever known that anything out of the ordinary had ever happened. How I was led from one side of that highway to the other without so much as a scratch under such impossible circumstances cannot be described by physical means, but it can be described by this promise: he shall give his angels charge over thee, to keep thee in all thy ways. What started out as a state of utter helplessness had been transformed into a tangible feeling of God's presence with me at that moment. This was an example of what it feels like to be reborn. As I've been sharing with you tonight, the dying Paul spoke of doesn't require a brush with death, although it might. This kind of dying takes place every time some limited mortal concept of ourselves or of God is put off and a more unlimited spiritual concept is adopted or put on. There is no question that this experience gave me a richer understanding of my closeness or oneness with God and lifted me a bit out of the belief that I was a vulnerable mortal at the mercy of random events. It was just one more proof before my final proof, the demonstration of eternal life. It was a resurrection indeed. Is resurrection possible for all of us? It is. Jesus' entire life and teachings were focused not on himself, but on us, on you and me and all mankind. Remember that it was he who said, I am come that they might have life and that they might have it more abundantly. It was Jesus' life, his final triumph over the flesh, that revealed for all of us that resurrection is a minute-by-minute experience. His ministry was spent showing us how to achieve it. Mrs. Eddy said, speaking of Jesus' disciples, his resurrection was also their resurrection. Well, his resurrection is also our resurrection. The Sermon on the Mount is his textbook. As long as we approach every new event as an opportunity to embrace the themes of that sermon and to see the new man in ourselves and others, to lift our thinking above what the material world is claiming about us and all mankind, we are putting off the old man and putting on the new. In so doing, we are experiencing the great, great blessing of resurrection thinking. So what are we waiting for? We have some resurrecting to do. Good night, and thank you.